Hi everyone, my name is Lisa Filion and you can find me as Pixel Princess on the Sketchy app. Today we're going to be starting lesson 1 of portraits in Procreate, and we're going to be looking at resolution, tools, brushes, and layers. So let's get started. So to start with, I've opened up the app, and what you're looking at is the gallery view in Procreate. So you can see thumbnails of the various canvases that I've created. And what I wanted to start by showing you is talking about resolution, but also creating custom canvas sizes and why that might be important. So if you look at the top right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see a plus button. You're just going to click on the plus. If you're doing a drawing, that's just for fun or possibly something that you just want to share on the Sketchy app or on social media, it might be fine to choose your screen size as an option. It's still a fairly high resolution because all of the iPads have nice resolution screens. Your screen resolution might be different than mine. It depends on what model of iPad that you have and what size the screen is. So that's something just to keep in mind. But then these options below here, these are all custom canvas sizes that I've created myself. And these are the standard sizes that I tend to use the most, especially when I print my work. So 8 by 10 inches, 11 by 14 inches, and 16 by 20 inches are all standard frame sizes. And just a tip for you guys, when you start to think about printing your artwork, you can save quite a bit of money by thinking about printing and formatting your work in sizes where you can buy picture frames just off the shelf without having to deal with custom framing and matting. So that might be something to keep in mind for when you want to print your work. So I'm going to show you how to do this right now. You're going to create a custom size, and in here it's usually defaulted to pixels. We're going to change it to inches. So we have our units of measurement over here. And we're going to change it just to 8 by 10, which is a nice size for both printing as well as being not too large for posting online. So it's kind of a happy medium if you just want to end up printing something fairly small scale, but also still nice quality. What you'll notice is my DPI is set to 300. If yours is not set to 300, I would recommend setting it right now. You can go higher than 300. Anything higher is going to be very high resolution. When you change this number, the maximum number of layers changes, and that also is dependent on the size of your canvas too. So if I changed this number to 20 inches, let's say, you'll see that my maximum number of layers actually goes down to 33, which is still a lot of layers. So I'm going to turn it back to 10 inches. And then you might want to get into the practice of also labeling or titling your canvases. This will be useful later on because then you guys can refer back to these canvases and continue to use them. You'll only have to make them once, so it'll be a shortcut for you. Okay, so we'll press done, and now it automatically opened up and created my canvas. What you might have noticed too is my iPad is turned in landscape mode, but my canvas is portrait mode, and that's because I put the 8 in as my first unit of measurement rather than the 10. So this is also useful for artists if you like to work in landscape mode, but you want to open your canvases up in portrait mode. Making custom canvases is the way to do that. Otherwise, you'll have to rotate the screen of your iPad. Whatever orientation your iPad is, when you create a new canvas, it'll automatically default to that orientation. So that's just another tip to consider. So now that you're familiar with some of the features of the gallery, we're going to go ahead and create a new canvas. I'm going to choose my 8 by 10 inches. And I wanted to show you some of the tools that we will be using in today's lesson. So to start with, you'll want to know how to pick your colors, which is in the top right corner. And you get this classic kind of disc view. You also get a view that's actually called classic, a values view, and then also this is where you're going to create new palettes. So I'm going to go back to disc view, and from here you can go into the disc and create any color that you want. I also want to take a look at layers because it becomes really important with drawing portraits so that you can have background, middle ground, and foreground layers. So make sure that you name your layers, and then to create a new layer, you're simply going to press the plus button. You also, of course, have your paintbrush tool, which is all of the different mediums that are available to you and types of brushes that are available to you within the app. So what's really cool about the program is that these different brushes really do mimic real-world textures and real-world mediums. So you can scroll through and see all of the options that are available to you, and then simply select the brush that you want. Another really important feature is the eraser tool, because if you click into it, you'll actually have all of those brushes that we just talked about, so you can actually customize your eraser to be any brush that you want. The last thing that I'm going to show you today, which is one of my favorite features of the app, is the transform tool. So if I draw a quick picture on here, I'm going to click on my transform tool. It looks like a little ribbon. I'm going to outline my heart, and then you can see that I'm on freehand. You can also choose automatic. Click on your arrow tool, which is your selection tool, and it'll isolate that particular part of the picture that you just drew around. And then you can actually manipulate it. So you can drag it, make it bigger or smaller, flip it, rotate it, do all of these manipulations to that particular part of your image. Okay, so in the last part of our lesson, we're going to create our first portrait, or begin to create it. So what I'm going to do is swipe up from the bottom, and I'm going to select my Photos app that I already previously had open, so it has to be in your bottom toolbar to do this. I clicked on it and I'm holding it, and I'm going to drag it to the left side until I see that bar appear and let it go to let it snap in place. The side-by-side feature is a really useful feature of iOS that I use all the time. You could obviously have your photo reference on another device or even print it off, but if you want to work all within your one device, this would be a great way of doing it, which is why I often, even if I'm working on a portrait, like to turn my iPad into landscape mode. So I've selected a few portraits that have inspired me on the Sketchy app. So I thought I would choose this one to start out with today. And in our program, we've already created that 8x10 canvas. So I'm going to open that up now. I'm going to change the color of my brush to black. And I'm going to change, or keep, I guess, my brush to an HB pencil. So I often start my portraits in a way that's pretty traditional, I would say, starting with a pencil drawing or a pencil sketch. So we're going to have our brush size be somewhat on the small side. I'm going to have my opacity turned up all the way. And what I thought we would start with is working on a little bit of proportion by just blocking in the basic shapes of the face, looking at areas as they relate to each other in terms of their size and their proportion. And we're going to do it with really loose, kind of broken, sketchy lines. So this is just one method that you might want to use when you're going about creating portraits. So you can make your canvas bigger or smaller by pinching and zooming. And you might want to, in the beginning, if you like to work in terms of scaling your work equally, you might want to have it roughly the same size. So then you can just get a sense of scale. So I'm doing this is called gesture drawing, doing very gestural lines. I'm not pressing hard on my Apple Pencil, so it is pressure sensitive. If I press really hard, I would get a dark line. So I'm barely touching the screen right now. And I'm just using these broken lines to rough in the basic form. So I see kind of a highlight there. Sometimes I'll just block in the shadows or the highlights. Okay, and I want to have room for her hair, and I feel like I've made my face a little bit larger. It's not quite in the same proportion as this one here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually use the transform tool that I showed you before, and I'm going to use that just to scale back my drawing a little bit. So you can move it around with one finger or pinch and zoom with the other, or with both. So I just want to make sure more of her hair fits. So I'm going to play around with that a little bit. Okay. So once you have it somewhat roughed in, I'm going to zoom right in to my picture. Maybe make my pencil a little bit bigger. And I'm going to go over it with a darker outline. So here's where I'm trying to be a bit more precise. You can look at where things line up in relation to other parts of the face. If you need to add in some grid lines, you can do that. What you can also do is, one thing that I like to do is actually block in the shading using a hatching technique. So I usually use either a technical pencil or, again, the HB pencil. So I'm just going to stay on that HB pencil, and wherever I see darks or shadows, just going to add in some hatching or cross hatching. Sometimes in my work I end up almost covering this up completely, and other times, a lot of the time, I will leave it to show through the color. And you can hopefully see that just with a few lines added, we're already starting to get that shape. And again, just even with using geometric shapes like circles or ovals or triangles, you can also try that, just blocking in where you're going to add shading. And then another thing I wanted to talk about was layers. So I'm only on one layer at this point. Name your layer something that makes sense to you. For me, I usually call mine sketch to begin with. And then when I start to add color, I kind of experiment with including color underneath my sketch and also over top my sketch. So I'm gonna call this layer color. And we're gonna go over top to begin with. I'll change my palette to, I have a skin tone palette that I created. And so what I'm gonna do is choose kind of a medium tone for the face. For this particular portrait, I'm going to use the round brush. I'm going to reduce my opacity and just lightly start to add in some color. And then if you have a pressure sensitive stylus, you don't necessarily have to change the opacity. You can just press a little bit harder on your stylus. If you're not using a pressure sensitive stylus, you're going to play around with opacity quite a bit in order to get that shading effect that you want. So I'm basically doing the same thing that I was doing with my hatching, whereas I'm blocking in the darkest areas, only this time I'm doing it with the color. When we talk about color in an upcoming lesson, I'll talk about working freely with color for portraiture. So if you look closely at this picture, there's actually quite a bit of yellow, quite a bit of warmth in the picture. So sometimes I get inspired by the lighting of the picture to add some color into my skin tones. But we'll talk more about that in our upcoming color lesson. Okay, so that is what the color would look like, just roughed in above the sketch. So I actually am hiding a lot of my lines, and you could take it to the point of continuously building your color layers to a point if you don't want to see those original hatching marks, you could completely cover them up, right? So we would just keep building that skin tone, keep layering until our pencil marks disappeared. However, another thing you might want to experiment with is what it looks like to have color underneath your sketch. It's quite dramatically different when you see the difference between underneath and over top of the sketch. This looks much smoother. The other one, we obviously see all of our line work. So stylistically, that's something to think about for what you want to achieve as an artist. And every time you create a new layer, it's really good practice to title your layer, because sometimes you might be working on an artwork that has, 20 or more layers, and it can get confusing what parts of the image. You do have a little preview, but it can still get confusing what's underneath what and where do you need to place these layers, and so it's always good practice to label them. And you can also kind of experiment with what kind of cool effects you can create by having a background color on your canvas, and you can see how that color is showing through on my color layer. So that might be something to play around with as well, especially thinking about maybe colors that complement each other, so color opposites on the wheel. So because my skin tone that I was working with was pretty warm, it had a lot of oranges and yellows in it, I chose a blue as my background color to really make those colors pop. So that's something else that might be useful when you're thinking about working with your layers. So we have a background color, we have a sketch layer that we did first, we have a color layer that we can kind of experiment with whether we want it over top or underneath, and we will continue to work with layers as we work through the course. Well guys, that concludes today's lesson. Thanks so much for drawing with me today.